you for having me. Also, I found it interesting that the attendance sheet gets handed out in the beginning, so the incentives are assigned and then you can leave, right? You should hand it out at the very
You have to
end.
come all the way up here to get it though.
That is, oh yeah, well done, well done. So I was asked to talk about 10 minutes about like how I got to stand here. So I'll tell an entertaining story about little Max and how he all of a sudden turned into a person that owns a suit jacket. And then I'll talk a little bit about the social cost of carbon. And then why it matters. I also do want to acknowledge Fran Moore, who really is a much deeper thinker on this topic than I am, a thought leader, and most importantly has worked in the White House and affected real change in this.
Not this White House.
No, not the last one,
Yeah.
the Biden one. But so if you find this interesting and you want to get real deep insights on this topic, I mean, you're always welcome to come to me, but if you want really good feedback, you should go talk to Fran. She really is truly outstanding and amazing, not just on this topic, but especially on this topic. All right, she's also going to ask the hardest questions, I assume. There we go. Okay. So Max, where are you from, Max? It is Oktoberfest. I gave a talk 2 days ago in Lederhosen, and the first question I got in Q&A was like, "What's up with the pants?" And I was like, "It's October. I'm Bavarian." So my grandparents, none of my grandparents had college degrees. They all did finish high school. They were born here, which was the Russian sector at the time. This is Germany, by the way, in case you're wondering. This was then Czechoslovakia, which is now 2 different countries. But my grandparents were born here in the Russian sector. And then through a long, really exciting story that I'm thinking I might write a novel about one day, they snuck out to the American sector and landed right here. And this is where I was born. So we could, I don't know if anybody knows what a BMX bike is. Maybe BMX bikes are still a thing. In the 80s, they were like, whoa, you had one of those, you were cool. So I had one. And you could ride your bike literally about 2.5 miles to the border on the Czech side and about 3 miles to the border on the East German side. There's something called the divided village. That was a 5-6 minute ride where the wall went right through the village. Why are you boring me with the stuff I already know? Here we go. If you rode up to the wall, this is what it looked like. All right, so there was a concrete wall. This was the western side. This was the eastern side. There were landmines right there. There were towers. We, of course, had lots of family in the east, and we went to visit them all the time. It was incredibly hard to get in. I remember them searching my math book for secret propaganda and things like that. It would take hours to cross the border. And if you wanted to come from east to west and you were under the age of 65, you couldn't. Only once you retired, they gladly let you go, so the pension then was paid by the western side. But as a kid, I was like, nothing crosses this wall, right? Or it's very, very hard to do so. So then we'd go play outside. This place is also called the Siberia of Bavaria. Bavaria already has really terrible weather. Where I grew up, it's terrible. It's like gray skies with this like 35-degree Fahrenheit, 70% humidity, like cold to your bone. And then in the winter, it snows. And then if it doesn't snow for a couple of days, we'd go outside and the snow looked like this. I stole this picture of the internet. That's not a picture I took. But it really did look like this. And you'd go ask mom, the source of all wisdom, at least in my youth, why is the snow so dirty? She's like, hey, don't eat it. Right? It's not just the yellow snow, the brown snow is also bad. But the notion here is this is air pollution that comes from low heat content coal that's being burnt on the Czech and East German side and just comes over here. I was like, whoa, like how do we stop it? And she was like, well, there's decisions made over there which we have no control over that have consequences for us here. So the only thing you can do is not eat it. Okay. So I was like, that's weird that decisions that people make elsewhere have consequences for my well-being here. So that was as a kid, I thought pretty cool insight already. And then we woke up one morning in the 80s. My mom came into my bedroom and she was just like, okay, time to get up. I'm going to drive you to school today. It was an accident somewhere in then the Soviet Union, where this, of course, is Chernobyl. the reactor had caught on fire, one of the biggest nuclear accidents in human history. And there was a huge cloud of radiation coming across where we lived and headed over to Sweden. So they were really worried that, rainfall would hit the kids, and nobody knew how much cesium and whatever else was in there. We also weren't allowed to forage for mushrooms anymore because we didn't have video games, right? So on the weekends, it was like, kids, yes, grab a basket and a knife. We're going to the woods to forage mushrooms, not the mushrooms that undergrads get excited about, but the ones that you eat with cream sauce. So none of that anymore because I think it's cesium-135 bioaccumulates in mushrooms. So another example of where I was like, whoa, decisions somebody made like 1,000 miles away from where I live have really immediate significant consequences for my well-being. So this was all this thinking of like, how do these problems actually work and how do you make this better? So we of course know this now as transboundary pollution problems, which you probably learned about in middle school, but to me this was sort of storytelling that I got really interested in. Then somebody showed me this picture at some point, I don't remember when. This is of course the pale blue dots, right, where we took a deep space probe. And some genius said, let's turn it around. I think it was Carl Sagan was involved in this, right? Turn it around and take a picture of Earth. So I was like, this is amazing, right? Everything I know, everything I'm ever going to do, consume, or leave behind for possible future kids, or I have ever consumed is trapped, except for sunlight, in this little pale blue dot right here. So resources are scarce, right? So, much like the candy I have in my drawer, how should I allocate or think about how we as humans allocate these resources across different uses? So fast forward, I went to college. It's a fun story. There was no internet. I was in Germany. You couldn't study environmental science in Germany. I really wanted to study environmental science. I asked somebody, what are the good schools in America? MIT, Harvard, Amherst, they gave me a bunch of names. So I called all these places, asked for the admissions office, called Amherst for the admissions office. They gave me a number. I applied. I got in. I showed up with my long hair, my cigarettes then, my guitar, and my, duffel bag, and realized that I had gotten into UMass Amherst instead of Amherst College. And I was like, okay, great. I saved a lot of money. They have a great program. It was the best random mistake that I ever made. I got a fabulous education at UMass Amherst. So if you have kids freaking out about not getting into Harvard, you can get amazing educations at a huge number of places. So I was at UMass running around. I was admitted as an environmental engineer. First day there, they said that takes 5 years. I was like, I only have money for 3. So they switched me over to proper environmental sciences. I did that. And then I had no money. I had 5 jobs. Foreign students, some of you know this, cannot borrow money through federal grants. So I walked in and said free pizza somewhere, and there was a talk. And I walked in and there was a person talking that is about 2 inches taller than I am and weighed about 40 pounds less. Very thin, tall man. Anybody know who this is? It's John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the preeminent economists, sort of liberal thinkers of the last century, one of the most well-spoken individuals I've ever heard either. So I'm sitting in there, I'm eating my pizza, it's free, I'm very excited, and I'm just sort of listening in. And he said this thing where he was like, well, if you want to affect, and I'm paraphrasing, affect change in the physical world, you can change invisible things and either prevent bad things from happening or really affect real change without ever picking up a shovel or anything like that. I was like, what are you talking about? Some Harry Potter kind of thing going on? Harry Potter hadn't come out then yet, but there's a German kind of version of it. And then I started listening, and he was, of course, talking about incentives, right? So if you make people face the right incentives, they will make smarter decisions. If you make gasoline more expensive, people will use less gas and drive smaller vehicles. We'll need smaller parking spaces. Anybody know how many parking spaces per American there are? We are at the Institute of Transportation Studies in America. Anybody? I don't know if this is right, but I looked yesterday, there appear to be 1.2 parking spots for every American in North America, which is nuts. But back up, So I was in there, I was studying toxicology because I was thinking remediation of soils was going to be my future. And that day I was like, I want to do this. This is what I want to learn economics. And I changed, added a minor in environmental economics that day, then got a master's degree, which was free at UMass in environmental economics. And then I was going to go work as a consultant. Nobody in my family has a Ph.D. And then one of my professors said, Max, why not a Ph.D? I was like, what's that? That seems like long and I don't have the money. They're like, it's free. You get paid and you get to ask the questions you want. And you seem pretty clever. Why don't you go apply? So I actually applied here. I got into Davis. I also got into UCSD. At the time, I believed I was going to be a time series econometrician. That was my goal in life. So I went to UCSD. I'm sorry. Got my PhD there, and then Berkeley was my very first job. But it really, there are these moments as a grad student or as an undergrad where sometimes faculty come in and just like open an idea to you that you never had. I never saw myself as a professor. I didn't know what a professor does or what a researcher does. I just looked at school as like this stamp you get and then you go off and make money and work somewhere. It was one of the most amazing things that ever happened to me. It is an amazing life, I have to say. I mean, there are moments, Fran and I occasionally will have a conversation where we're like, "Grr." But that's true in all careers. It's a really good profession. So, okay. So what's the goal that we sort of are trying to achieve, and what are we trying to ask? So I'm going to go from like space to like some very specific research questions now. But the goal as I see it, and it's actually I think a little bit broader than this, but if I think of economics, I think the goal should be is to make humankind, and by humankind, I would personally include sort of ecosystem services and critters and soil microbes and things like that, but to make humankind as well as possible in the face of scarcity, right? So for those of you, anybody here never taken an econ class? I love it. Okay, we got to get you in. It's just Econ 1 taught by somebody inspiring is a super fun class. Taught by somebody not so inspiring, it is torture. It's like statistics. It needs to be well taught. But scarcity has a very specific interpretation, but it's also very broad. Most people just think of it as the amount of money I have in my wallet or in my bank account, and that's scarcity. But scarcity is so much broader, right? Money is fundamentally boring. It's just a means of transactions, right? It's a common unit in which we trade things. Versus scarcity is much more interesting. We all face the same scarcity of time, right? We all have the same number of hours in a week. There's scarcity of knowledge, right? How well are we able to translate sunlight into usable electricity in a form of energy? There's a scarcity of entrepreneurial talent. There's definitely, if you've ever worked in a university, a scarcity of administrative talent, right? There's scarcity of resources in the ground. There's a finite capacity of the atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gases. So scarcity is everywhere, right? And what we have to realize is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to make us, and note it doesn't say humankind now at this point in time. I include humankind now and until the end of time, right, as well as possible in the face of scarcity that we have now. That's a hard problem, right? How do we make decisions when individuals make decisions about what resources they consume? But in the middle, there's some sort of planning thing that also happens where governments and regulators intervene in the allocation and functioning of how these resources get allocated. So I have two slides. I'm going to skip. No, there's two slides coming in a second. I'm going to skip there about me because I want to talk about science instead about me. But the two big ideas, and this is directed at you, master's students and undergrads, is reading is hugely important, and don't just read stuff in your specialty area. I read a wild mix of things. I read science fiction novels, I read historical biographies, I read, fun books, like whatever, but just read voraciously. You never know where your next idea is going to come from. I'm working on a paper right now that comes out of a paper called The Deluge. It's a 1,200 page bio-disaster future science fiction novel. It was fabulous, but there was one nugget in there that I thought was really clever, and I was like, we could think about this now, right? So you never know where your ideas come from. So read Marx. I'm not trying to turn you into Marxists, right? But people don't understand what Marx actually said. So read some Marx, good for you. Read for people who wrote about Marx and Engels. But the basic idea out of, Marx that came out, that how we allocate resources is there's some central planner, some central unit that decides who gets what resources and what gets made, right? So there's somebody in the middle that has huge informational requirements about how are we going to make exactly that yellow sweater. I think that's yellow, I'm a little colorblind, but that yellow sweater right there that you decide you want to wear this year, right now. Some central planner would have to decide that we have to make it and get it to you because that's what you want, right? That it's just a sweater, but if we're thinking about potatoes, gasoline, cars, education, everything, the informational requirements to get this right are really, really high. So in comes Adam Smith. When I finally retire, I'm going to get his haircut so I can be recognized as a market, based economist right here. But Smith's, and it's always attributed to him, but there's a bunch of people who were involved in the making of this enterprise, basically said, take the central planner out and let's have markets figure out who gets what and when and what gets made, right? So if the Gap, that's the only clothing brand I know, makes 20,000 of these yellow sweaters right there and charges $59 for it, and nobody's willing to pay $59 for these sweaters, they will reduce the price until they get sold and probably not make any more sweaters next year. So markets have this amazing mechanism through prices to allocate what gets made, right? Send a signal to firms how much of what should get made, and tell customers, right, here's what it would take for you to obtain that individual unit. And they move around and fluctuate, and that's, one of the most beautiful things in economics is looking at prices. Okay, so we're about to dive into the social cost of carbon, but I am going to stress, in ITS and in your institute, it's sort of cheesy to say we work with public agencies. I mean, this place is so connected to the world of transportation in the state and in the federal government and internationally as well. But I think it's important to keep in mind as an academic that if you're just like writing papers for other academics or writing papers for other academics, I think in what we do, that's a hugely missed opportunity. So Fran mentioned I blog, right? Whenever we have a paper or something, we write a one-page blog. We don't get a billion hits. Like I'm sure the music blogs with, it's Taylor Swift release day, have like 10 billion hits or something. We get a couple of thousand. But if you see who reads our blog, it's, DOT, it's CARB, it's the utilities, it's people who think about this stuff. So getting this information to the audience that can make better decisions, or for whom the insights you generate are useful, it's really important to do, right? So if you want to talk about this over lunch or something on how to do this, I'm happy to help you, but that's the basic idea. So let's talk about climate change. Again, I thought CO2 was no longer a pollutant. It's still a pollutant, right? So what I'm trying to say here is the challenge is quite tricky, right? So there's this goal to reduce or keep warming limited to 2 degrees Celsius, which actually, and Frank can correct me if I'm wrong, but my best understanding, that's actually a number that Bill Nordhaus sort of came up with at some point and said that seems like a reasonable goal. He's an economist. He knows no climate science, but for some reason people then kept repeating it, and that's the number we're using. Right, but what I'm trying to say with this particular graph, which I'm very proud of because it's animated and made in Stata, not in R. You try and make something like this in Stata, that takes real skill. In R, that's easy. But what I'm trying to say here is emissions have been growing, right? And it's a little bit like a diet before the holidays. It's now October. My mom's going to show up sometime second week of December. And German moms, I don't know what it is, they always look at their sons and they're like, you could stand to lose a few pounds. It's always the notion. So I'm trying to preemptively lose a few pounds. If I started now, right, I've got 2 months. Losing 4 or 5 pounds, pretty easy. Like cut out the wine and the candy and you'll be fine. If I wait until the day before she gets here, right, it's gonna be really hard. Unfortunately, with climate change, we're waiting until the day before she gets here kind of strategy. So what this does here is it's just a path of, what the emissions path, and this is an approximation, right? There's things wrong with this red graph right here. But since CO2 is roughly a stock pollutant, the longer we wait, the steeper the emissions reductions we're going to have to achieve to make the 2-degree goal are going to be. Or we're just going to miss the goal, which is what I think is going to happen. But that's the notion. We can talk about that one. I'm a little bit Debbie Downer today. So alarms are going off. There's another report out of Germany today that like everything, the world's coming to an end, but emissions continue to go up. There are some encouraging signs, right? The biggest news out of the New York Climate Summit, everybody talked about the president's speech. I think the most important thing that actually happened there was the Chinese premier stepping up and saying, we're committing to actually reducing emissions, a weight-based reduction, not an intensity-based reduction. Of course, explaining this, like, this is an intensity-based, and he said something about the numerator, not the fraction, is hard to explain. But instead of saying, we're going to reduce the CO2 per dollar of GDP, which they've always said something about, they finally said, we're going to reduce the actual amount of CO2 we're going to emit, which from the biggest polluter on the face of the planet is a huge statement. But if you're looking at the world of impacts and what's happening in terms of weather patterns and ocean warming and all that, every time we get news, there's very few good news I see, or maybe I'm reading the wrong blogs, but things seem to be getting worse faster than we thought. Okay, Max is an economist, so I'd lose my card as a card-carrying economist if I didn't say, well, the solution to everything in global climate change is carbon pricing, right? We're going to talk about this in a second, but basically, if you emit a ton of carbon, you're free riding, right? Republicans hate free riders, Democrats hate free riders, everybody hates a free rider. So if you are out there in a place where carbon isn't regulated and you're not paying a price on carbon, you are using the atmosphere as a trash can and you're not paying for it, right? So the econ insight is pretty basic. Let's figure out how much damage 1 unit of pollution does in dollars, and then charge people that amount in form of a tax, roughly. It's a little more subtle than that, but that's the basic idea, right? Pay for, like, if you have a house, which most grad students don't, but in order to use my trash cans, I have to pay every month for the use of the trash can. So comparing the atmosphere to a trash can is not very nice, right? It's a beautiful thing, but the intuition is the same. So 2 questions arise. 1, how much should we charge? That's what we're going to talk about a lot in a minute. And 2, can we get people to charge it? Like a price at all. So this is the World Bank's carbon dashboard. They keep track of who's charging a price on carbon. I find this hugely misleading. So if I had a data visualization class, I would give this a B-. Because here, for example, if you look at the United States, it says North America is almost completely covered by a carbon price. That's of course not true at all. California is, thanks to the cap and trade, right? There's Reggie on the East Coast, there's stuff going on in Quebec and places like that, but the vast majority of North America does not have a carbon price on it. So this map here says if one subdivision of the country has a carbon price, we're going to paint it. But to make a long story short, there are not, the complete coverage is an exaggeration, right? We've got about, I think it's a third. I was going to look that up earlier. It's roughly a third of emissions, might be a little less, is covered by some price. And then the question is, how much are most of these places charging? So Uruguay is leading the charge, right, with a very high price of somewhere in the 160s, 170s. This is about a year and a half old. This should be updated, this slide. Liechtenstein, which nobody can find in a map, even though now they can. There's like some TikTok campaign to make Liechtenstein well known to everybody. It's contained within Switzerland. Switzerland, Sweden, EU ETS, that's somewhat significant, right? Somewhere around $100, it floats. But if you go across here, right? The tail of places that have covered their emissions with some sort of price is pretty low, somewhere in the $0 to $10, $15 range. Max, how do you know this is low, right? Is this just you saying, hey, it's low? Do I have until 11:20, is that right?
11:30, and
Okay.
then there's like
Then there's-
spare time to till 12, so you can.
I'll
be
easily
flexible.
get this done by 11:30. I was just panicking for a second that I only had 10 minutes left. Okay, so we're good. So takeaway from this is there's incomplete coverage globally of a carbon price, and then even the ones that charge, many of these places don't charge a price, as I'm going to show you in a second, is even remotely close to what we think that damage is, the damage that 1 ton of CO2 does. Okay, so let's talk about the thing. Now Fran can take a nap for 15 minutes because she knows this stuff better than I do, or she can pay close attention and say, Max, that ain't right. Can you redo this? Okay, so the social cost of carbon, which sometimes we say is the most important number that nobody's ever heard of, you've probably heard of it. The social cost of carbon is an estimate, right? That's an important thing. It's not a guess, it's an estimate, right? We're trying to calculate a number of the global economic damages, right? So how much damage does 1 ton of CO2 that's emitted in a given year do? And here's where it gets tricky, across all relevant sectors. So think of all sectors that are affected by climate change. Migration, electricity consumption, right? You consume more electricity in the summer, less natural gas in the winter. Agricultural yields, corn hates hot days. Keep on going. How about some non-market stuff? Mortality, right? People die when it's really hot outside. Turns out a lot of people die when it's really cold outside, right? So if you have fewer cold days but more hot days, what happens to mortality? We could keep on going. Forests, water consumption. I don't know, I've left out some cool ones like conflict, right? What happens to the frequency and intensity and duration of conflict? So if you're thinking about all the sectors that a changing climate will affect, it's many, and not all of them are measured in units that are actually conveniently turned into US dollars or rupees or whatever your favorite currency is. The other issue that's a real pain in the neck here is if you emit 1 ton of CO2 today, it's with us for hundreds, depends on how you calculate it, let's call it hundreds of years. So the notion here is what you do today has consequences for generations after us. So not only do you have to figure out that ton of CO2 you're emitting today, what damage does that do to, or what impact does that have on electricity consumption today? What impact does that have on electricity consumption in the year 2300? Okay, 2300, we can do some math, right? It's 2025. So that's 275 years from now. We can subtract 275 from 2025. So we're at 1950, 1850, 1750. Imagine putting yourself somewhere in 1750. There's no cars, right? Weren't invented yet. People spend a lot of time on horseback, walking around cities. Public health was a total nightmare. Everything was, the Industrial Revolution was just about to kick off a couple of decades later, very small in England. Try and put yourself in the shoes of some academic in Cambridge or Oxford, temples of higher education at the time, trying to predict what the world in 2025 was going to look like in terms of energy consumption, population levels, wealth, and so on. Really hard task. I would argue we'd probably be marginally better at this now, but the task isn't any easier, and trying to figure out how we're going to cool indoor environments, how we're going to grow crops, and so on 250 years from now is, most economists look at you when we say we do these exercises and they say you're nuts, right? People shouldn't do this. But the answer is, if you want to calculate this number, you got to do it. We're also going to get to talk a little bit about how do we value the well-being of individuals 200 years from now. That's another one. That's a philosopher's question that I really like discussing with my philosophy colleagues who are much smarter than I am, but they give the worst seminars. They stand there and they read a paper they've written and nobody gets to interrupt. It's really not good. Okay, So the social cost of carbon origin story, this is one of my, I'm probably not surprising that I disagree with Ronald Reagan on not everything, but many things. But this is a lovely photo that I think Richard Avedon took of Ronald Reagan. Turns out President Reagan actually was hugely important for environmental issues in the United States because he required that all federal rules have to undergo benefit cost analysis. Well, if you want to do a new rule, right, require people to drive more fuel efficient cars, you have to calculate the benefits from that rule and the costs, right? How much less gas do we consume? How much money do people save? And so on, but also the costs, like how much higher are the costs of making these more fuel efficient cars, and you have to compare them. I've never read a Reagan biography, but I'm going to just wildly speculate that he was probably thinking that most environmental regulation would not pass a benefit cost test. Turns out a lot of environmental regulation passes benefit cost tests by huge ratios. The Clean Air Act, 7 to was it 7? I forget, but it's not even close, right? The Clean Air Act has generated multiple times the benefits of what it cost us to regulate air quality. So fast forward to 2006, DOT, the Department of Transportation, I don't need to say that in this building, right? So DOT basically said, we're going to redo fuel economy. We don't know how to deal with greenhouse gases, so we're just going to say there are $0 in benefits from, avoided greenhouse gas emissions. Whoever that judge was, whose name I should probably know and should have a portrait in my house somewhere, said, I don't know either what the number is, but I sure know it's not 0, right? So come back and come back with a better number, which of course, if you're some person working on a VC, you're like, oh my God, how do I do that? Fast forward further, President Obama convened the interagency working group that was charged with exactly this. Instead of just back of the envelope come up with numbers, let's come up with one number for the entire federal government that we're going to use. So this is an incredible effort. Cass Sunstein and Michael Greenstone and a bunch of other, Gina McCarthy, who's a really cool person to talk to, all got together with all the agencies and they started this effort to basically come up with a way to calculate this particular number. They calculated the number. It was somewhere in the $40 range, right, in the end, again, approximating things right here. And then they did something really cool. They said, here's what we did. They went to the National Academies. It was Ken Gillingham, who was actually in the White House at the time, and walked the thing over to the National Academies into a room like this, where a bunch of nerds, including yours truly, I played a minor role though, sat in the room, and they asked, can you review this and tell us what we did here, is it right? And if it isn't, how do we do better? This is just an amazing process of translating science into an actual policy relevant number and then asking for formal peer review from the world's expert on this. So we did the National Academies review, released our report literally a month before President Trump 1.0 was elected. His first act in office was to disband the interagency working group and set the social cost of carbon from $42 to $1, right? Depending on the discount rate. Second act of President Biden was to undo that, recharge the interagency working group and put in place a social cost of carbon. Does this number matter? I haven't added this up. I stole this number from Tamara Carlton. But basically, if you're looking at when you use the social cost of carbon and look at which benefit cost analyses it was used, it's got to be more than 100 regulations at this point with way north of $1 trillion worth of benefits. So this is a big deal. This is not some nerdy small number where people are going, you should be using it. This is really important. Okay, so this is a terrible graph. I made this. But basically just showing you some of the evolution from 2008 over to the 2023 graph, right? The social cost of carbon kept on moving to the right. And we're going to talk a little bit about what was in the 2023 version of the social cost of carbon. The current Trump administration is not trying to just make the numbers smaller, but they're basically trying to kill it completely, right? So basically say, well, they've said this, right? Do not use this number in federal rulemaking because there is uncertainty. To that point, I'm also going to say we should not save for retirement, right? You should never go to the doctor for your what's it called, like preemptive checkups and things like that. If you don't act based on uncertainty, like what are we doing? You also shouldn't get in a car because God forbid you might get lost or get in an accident. Okay, so that was me being naggy. Why does it matter, right? Why do we need a number here? We're going to talk a little bit about how it relates to the tax I was talking about, but in benefit cost analysis, people have all kinds of different ideas of what are good ways to reduce CO2 emissions. They have drastically different costs, right? So what you want to do is you want to compare the benefits to the costs. And if you only have a number for costs, you have nothing to compare it to. So here, you know, if you go with the original Biden 51 social cost of carbon, the last Biden number, then the update we're going to talk about was $195, right? Some policies that don't make sense under a $55 or $51 number actually do make sense under a $200 number. So getting that number right is important and might make some policies make sense that didn't when the number is smaller. Also, just making it clear, the goal of scientists here is not to make the number as big as possible, which some parts of science seem to be engaged in that activity, but it's about getting the best, most reasonable, defensible number you can get. Okay, quick one. I'm about to show you a website where you can do this yourself. It's called the Muni Project. It's really cool. If you like coding, you can go home this weekend, listen to Taylor Swift and code your heart away. If you speak Julia, if you don't, if you speak Python, you can learn Julia very, very quickly. But the notion here is you're going to create a future scenario of the world. You're going to protect what population in different spaces is across the world out to 2300. You're going to project how rich those people are that can vary across space. But again, like if you're thinking about population forecasts, the UN's population forecasts stop in 2100. The furthest GDP forecast you're going to find anywhere is like 5-10 years out. That's it, right? So we're going all the way to 2300. Then you're going to use a model to translate income and population through some representation of technology into an emissions path, right? How much CO2 are these people of differing wealths going to? It's the plural of wealths? No. English is my second language, so I'll look that up later. But you're going to translate into emissions trajectory. So now we've gone from population income into CO2 emissions. Then you have some climate model there in the middle that takes the emissions as an input and translates into a trajectory of temperature and sea level rise, and if it gets fancy, some ocean acidity as well. And then what you're going to do is you're going to translate this environment, right, this hot earth and a certain amount of sea level into economic damages, right? What does this mean for migration, mortality, if you're really cool, morbidity, energy consumption, agricultural yields, property values at the coasts, and if you're interested in coral reefs, right? So then you have some damages. You have a pathway of damages out to 2300, and then you're going to go back, and then you're going to do a trick. You're going to do something called a carbon pulse. So at one point in time, you're going to add 1 ton, depending on the model, sometimes it's like 1,000 tons or whatever. It's called 1 ton of CO2, and you're going to run it again. But you're going to run this future world, same income and population in most models, right? But you're going to add 1 more ton of CO2, and you're going to run it again. So you're going to get slightly, higher emissions by that 1 ton. You're going to get probably slightly higher or different temperature patterns, slightly higher sea level, and slightly higher damages right here. It's not going to get hotter everywhere. Coastal California might actually get cooler because we're pulling Carla fog in onto the land, maybe, but that's a different story. But now I have basically 2 projections of damages, one with that additional ton of carbon, one without it. So I can take the difference between these 2, the stream of damages, and that's the stream of damages that 1 ton of CO2 is going to do over the next 275 years. And that's where it gets difficult. You're like, well, this already sounded pretty difficult. But then we're going to have to take a stand, which we're going to do at the very end. How do we value, our grand to the 7th children's consumption relative to our own? By consumption, I mean lost consumption due to damages they incur. And that's a very flaky interpretation of what the number actually is, but one that people actually understand. Okay. So the social cost of carbon takes a stand on how much we value consumption, discounts that stream of damages into present value. And that present value is the social cost of carbon, right? It's all the damages that 1 ton of CO2 does over time, discounted like a cash flow in some sense into one number, and that's the SCC. Cool. So I'm not going to bore you with this. I'm happy to share these slides, by the way, if you find this exciting. There's stuff in here. But the National Academy of Sciences, I've never been part of one of these panels. It's unbiased, right? They just call in specialists and you're locked in a room. The outside world doesn't get to see the discussion. So people are free to speak very frankly amongst the working group and really like pick stuff apart. You get to call in experts that are not part of the working group. Amazing process. So Maureen Cropper, who's one of the few environmental economists that's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences. And if you've never met her, just a true force of nature. I love Maureen Cropper, and Richard Newell, who was the head of Resources for the Future, also administrator of the Energy Information Administration at one point, chaired the thing. And it was a truly interdisciplinary group. And we just basically picked the thing apart and made some suggestions, right? The original models, 2 of them were essentially spreadsheets, which you're like, I'm sorry, what? You're doing this in Excel? Yes, they were basically run in Excel. And one of them was Excel, and the other one, I forget what. Were they all 3 Excel?
Fund was in like C++.
Yes,
with David.
That's right. Richard Toll and David Antoff ran theirs in C++, which nobody even knows what that is anymore outside of computer sciences. So very much not transparent. So we basically said, why don't you come up with modules so experts in these different areas can actually make this right. There were mistakes in the climate model, and that's called not mistakes, but there were assumptions in there that the climate scientists had issues with, and so on. We really picked on the characterization of uncertainty, right? In the paths of emissions and population and uncertainty in parameters, right? How sensitive is our oceans to uptake of carbon and so on. So the most important thing for maybe Fran and I, because we worry about this all the time, was the damage functions in there were so old. And if you actually dug in where they came from, sometimes you couldn't even find where they came from. So I call some of these just made up. But they were basically written in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and so much statistical work has happened since then to update these damage functions that we have not a perfect handle at all, but a much better handle than what was in there before on damages. So let me go through these for a second. But before I do this, I just also want to say, one of my big issues with science sometimes these days is it feels like we're developing like some celebrity scientists, right? Real Madrid doesn't win championships just because of Cristiano Ronaldo, but there's like 20, he's not at Real Madrid anymore, I know, trust me. But there were 23 others involved and probably 300, 400, 500 physios and others that helped make that happen. Science is fundamentally a team sport and we should treat it as such. That's me. Question?
Well, my question, Leander, may I ask now?
You can totally ask now.
Right.
If I don't know the answer, then I'll just tell you I'll answer it at the end. So, yeah.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what you mean by damage functions.
Can I hold that question because I'm exactly going to talk about this in like 4 minutes. Okay, I've got pictures, I got cartoons and all kinds of stuff. So I'll show you exactly what that is. Okay. But what I'm going to say is when Trump 1 canceled this, there were 2 groups, one at the University of Chicago, Berkeley, a consulting firm, and Rutgers that got together and said, we're going to like figure out the damage functions that haven't told you yet what they are, but we're going to make them better and build models. So we're going to take on some of those challenges. And Resources for the Future, this was where Fran was involved and David Antoff was involved. They did a parallel effort that focused some on the damage functions, but to me did some really amazing work, not just on damages, but also on projections of socioeconomics bringing in the right sort of climate people to build a model and think very carefully about how we value a future consumption. And then these might be the four most important people in this whole process. This is the EPA's NCEE. They have a whole branch of people who do environmental economics. They all have PhDs. All of these folks could get faculty positions in very good places, but they've decided to work in the federal government. This person here is Al McGartland. Al McGartland is, to me, the most influential environmental economist of the past 50 years. Easy, right? He's been in federal government for a long time. He's the one that made sure that best available science got translated into federal rules and implementation. He's now retired. He's going to be at NYU thinking big thoughts. So now we get to find out what Al really thinks. I'm really excited. But they were instrumental in then, once the science was done and Biden came into office, and picking up that science and turning it around and turning it into meaningful policy very quickly. So team sport. Okay, so almost there to answer your question. But the modular structure basically said, okay, we've got to draw a world with future levels of population and incomes. We've got to think carefully about representing a climate model in a way that a computer can calculate quickly, right? We don't need to project 700 different indicators of different altitudes and ocean depths. We just need something that's right, but runs relatively quickly. Then damage functions, translating weather and climate into economic measures of welfare, which I'm going to talk about, and then this thing about future streams of consumption. We're also going to talk, if I have time at the end, a little bit about equity and global versus domestic damages, which is something that comes up over and over again. Okay, so some of you might have used the so-called SSPs, right? These are the IPCC scenarios. This is, I think, the old graph. There's a cooler graph now, but I'm just slow. So the notion here is there's these socioeconomic projections that the IPCC uses underlying a lot of the climate modeling scenarios. They don't have a direct translation into future scenarios of population or income or anything like that. They're consistent with, right? So these are not bottom-up built scenarios. This much population and income turns into this much emissions, but it's based on different scenarios of forcing. They don't have probabilities associated with them. They're just four scenarios. So most people treated them as equally likely, right? In many settings. So what RFF, sorry, so this is population, sorry. So there's four population scenarios right here. People treated them equally likely, but uncertainty is really, I almost swore there for a second. Uncertainty is really tough, right? How likely is this scenario relative to this scenario right here? So what RFF did is they did something really cool. They hired two of the world's most phenomenal econometricians, right? So I think it was Mark Watson, Jim Stock. I think Ulrich Miller was in there too. Like, these are unbelievably talented people that have been doing this for a long time. And they said, give us your best shot. How do you do with a statistical model, long run projections? And then they delivered them. And then they went to a bunch of experts who calculate the UN population projections and said, here's what the statistical model says. Help us rule out some of the stuff that violates the demographic equivalent of laws of thermodynamics, right? That's just never going to happen. So what we have now is we have a set of population projections that you can download and use in your own work if you want, that actually have probabilities assigned to them that are based on a statistical model, but also bounded by experts. So not blindly just using some crazy statistical model, but actually got a gut check on it. They did the same thing for GDP. That looks something like this. So if you need projections out to 2300, I think these are the only ones I'm aware of that you could ever possibly use. The one thing I'm going to note on the side that makes me, as a person that, you know, at age like 12 had the Club of Rome report on his night table. If you don't know what that is, you're so young. But the 2% growth out to 2300, right? With 2% growth, we're doubling GDP every 30, 35 years. Over 250 years, that's a lot of GDP. So I'm gonna shrug and say, okay, these are the numbers we got out of this exercise. The cool thing then is this translates into emissions projection. So again, you now have, instead of having these 4 scenarios, this is the famous SSP 8.5 that is very bad and we don't think is going to happen. But instead of having these 4 scenarios that you don't know which one's going to happen, you now have a density of projections based on these other forecasts that helps you figure out, what do emissions trajectories actually possibly look like in a probabilistic world. The one thing I'm sort of sad about is the general climate community has not picked this stuff up very much at all. They keep on going with these SSP things. So to me, this is an underutilized set of information. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on climate models because I don't understand them and I find them not very interesting, and there's others that are way better at it, but they've updated the climate models. It's called the, Fran, help me, what's the climate model? FAIR? FAIR, right? Cool acronym. The FAIR model, it runs very quickly, it's built in, but most importantly, the physics in there are correct, right? Or are consistent with our best understanding of what's happening. So again, here you get some surface temperature projections. Again, full characterization of uncertainty. Now I'm finally going to get to answer the question you asked. So here we go. What's your name?
Topper.
Topper. All right, nice to meet you. So what we're thinking about damage functions, and I'm going to show you a picture of one in a second right here. You want to figure out what happens, how many people die in a location on a day with a temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So what you're trying to figure out is essentially you're estimating what public health folks call a dose response function between economic damages, use mortality, you could use energy consumption, agricultural yields, and on the right-hand side is some function of weather. Where this gets really hard is if I do this today, I can figure out in the city of Davis, if I had mortality statistics for 20 years and so on, and weather things, I could run a regression and figure this out. But if climate changes, right, everybody here has air conditioners already because it's so hot and humid. But in San Francisco, for example, it doesn't get very hot very often, so nobody has air conditioners. If San Francisco all of a sudden gets the climate of Davis, right, everybody in San Francisco, even the hippest of hipsters, are going to have air conditioners. So the question that becomes really challenging, estimating these dose response functions, these damage functions that are valid out to 2300, I need to project how you in 2300 with that counterfactual air conditioner that I don't know how it's going to be operated, right? Electricity, whatever, it could be something else. I need to predict what the mortality consequences in a world where you've adapted, right? So damages, these damage functions translate weather under different climate scenarios into what we call damages or measures of economic well-being over the next 2300 years. Again, that's a gross simplification of how this works. And Fran's written 2 amazing review pieces that you should read. And then, I've written one and many people have written some, so I'm happy to send you some stuff to read. But this is where we economists and statisticians are most active, is in this particular world, right? So you want to have something that works across the globe, right? You want to make sure it accounts for adaptation out to 2300. You want to make sure there's no confounding stuff going on here, that you're, confounding political instability or something like that with weather. You should cover extreme events, right? That we have experienced or maybe haven't experienced yet. And you should allow for people to react differentially in different places, right? It's really hard to do. So what we've currently got in the official number that under Biden we had, there's mortality, energy, agriculture, coastal assets, buildings on the coasts, and some measures of productivity in there, right? What we used to have in the old ones, but the damage functions were terrible. Forests were in there, water was in there, mostly water quality, I believe, and then vector-borne diseases, how far do mosquitoes travel and give you malaria under different scenarios of climate change, and we also had big storms in there, which we don't have anymore. So we took those out because we couldn't calculate. When I say we, I had nothing to do with that, but like it was taken out because we couldn't calculate the right damage functions. What's still not in there is species loss, right? What happens when all our lizards die, or, you know, mountain lions go, or some bacteria that grows on some piece of tree rind somewhere in the Amazon that could cure all cancer goes, right? Due to climate change, that's not in there. Migration is not yet in there, but that's one of the next ones that's going to make it. Air pollution, right? What happens in a world that's hotter? More ozone, but you know, if we're doing all kinds of energy efficiency investments and using renewables, what happens to PM, for example? And then these are just examples: crime and conflict, right? Humans are more likely to turn into violent jerks when it's hot outside than when it's not, right? There's all kinds of evidence. People are arguing over what the mechanism is. My favorite example of this, there's a paper where a bunch of grad students got into a car in a shopping mall lot and would pull up to the red light on the exit of the parking lot right there. And then when the light turned green, they'd just sit there and they'd count the number of seconds until the person behind them honked. And you could show that on hot days, the person behind you honks much more quickly than on cool days. But Saul Shang, Ted Miguel, and Marshall Burke have a review paper that basically shows that all sort of measures of violence and a lot of crime are correlated positively with higher temperatures. The mechanisms aren't clear, but the correlation is there. Okay, so I have about -2 minutes. Let me get briefly at the discounting, right? This is totally boring, but this is maybe one of the most important things in this whole process. Like, how much value do we place on a unit of consumption of your, 10 generations from now removed great-grandchildren? So discounting was, this is like Dodgers versus Giants. Is that the big rivalry, right, in baseball? I don't understand baseball, but so there was in academia a similar thing. There were different camps that have very strong different opinions. But basically, we're using a type of discounting now that's different than before, that takes the rate of economic growth into account, right? Most people agree that this is the right way to do it. And there was also an expert elicitation, which was really important, by one of Fran's co-authors, another fabulous German environmental economist rooting for the wrong soccer team, that just asked experts, what do you think the right rate is, the right number? Right? And they came up with something in the neighborhood of 2%, which was lower than what we had before. To make a long story short, we changed the approach that how we discount, and this is not 100% fair comparison right here, but what we had is these were the early Biden numbers under the old social cost of carbon, under a 2.53 and 5% discount rates, right? On the right-hand side here, the proposed values were 1.5%, 2%, and 2.5%. It's not just the number that was different here, it's also the way you actually do the discounting that's different. But these are the distributions of the social costs of carbon. So initially, I hate snarky remarks, even though I make them all the time. People were like, oh, we did all this academic work and all you did is change the discount rate. So I just did a quick and dirty, compared the distribution of the social cost of carbon using the old 2.5% discount rate modeling, using the old damage functions and everything. And this is the blue one, is the new one, right? They're different. Like the mean of the old one's 52, the new one is 120, right? Yes, discounting changed the number quite a bit, but it's not just discounting. But it's hugely important what happened to this number. Okay, let me take 3 minutes and then wrap up. There's a raging debate, which I have really strong opinions about, and I'm definitely right, about domestic versus the global social cost of carbon. There is a debate. The Trump administration in their first round basically said that we're going to go to domestic damages because we're going to only care about climate change damages from Americans, right? So only take the share of climate change damages to Americans, and that's how we're going to evaluate benefits against costs. If every country in the world does that, we're going to do too little mitigation, right? Too little emissions reductions, and you're going to get to a globally inefficient outcome. It makes absolutely zero economic sense. The only way this makes sense is if you're a lawyer. I have some family members who are lawyers, but they're always wrong. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I am pretty sure that we cannot calculate a credible domestic social cost of carbon for issues that Fran has pointed out, not in this context, but over and over again, there's general equilibrium effects. If something happens elsewhere that has consequences for us, if something happens here, a big storm that through trade networks and migration patterns filters over elsewhere, the world is a deeply connected place, and just saying it's America only rules out that stuff that happens elsewhere is going to have consequences for us. We could keep on going about why it's a dumb idea. I'm working on a piece that says this is a dumb idea. The editor keeps on saying, don't call it that. The other thing, and this is sort of the closing thought here, I think one of the most exciting things to think about is equity, right? Not just across space. We know that one additional dollar to a poor person is worth more than additional dollar to overpaid Max, right? Dollar to me is like, that's a tip after I buy my $5 chamomile tea with one tea bag over at your Pete's right here, right? A dollar to somebody in sub-Saharan Africa and Niger, you know, subsistence farming is a huge amount of money. So when we're thinking about climate change damages, right, should we weight $1's worth of damages to an American in Northern California the same as $1's worth of damage to a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa? And the answer to me is clearly not, right? So there are methods that David Anthoff at Berkeley, who's another German environmental economist, but very much for the right soccer team, has been thinking deeply about how would you calculate a social cost of carbon if you do weighting of damages that takes into account that $1's worth of damages to a poor person are worse than $1's damage to a rich person. They've been pushing this in the scientific literature, but the German Umweltbundesamt, which is our EPA, actually uses an equity-weighted social cost of carbon. Okay, so if you want to
What can I
code,
do an asterisk?
yeah,
So does the UC system.
we
Yeah,
do.
We have an internal infrastructure planning, social cost of carbon that is equity weighted.
Did you push them to do that? You can take credit.
They didn't need any pushing.
Okay, good. No, that's awesome. I'm gonna add that to my talk from now on. Fran said.
David was involved too.
Okay. If you want to play with this stuff, this is amazing. The Mimi project is basically, it lives in the open. You can download stuff. It took me, I don't write in Julia. It took me 5 minutes to get going here. You install Julia and you can run these types of models. You can change assumptions. You can add sectors, subtract sectors, but it has everything in there. It's super fun if you're really nerdy. I still don't know why it's called Mimi. I should ask him. I'm out of time. We should work on water. Tama Carlton's doing that. We should work on forests. Hannah Druckenmiller is working on that a little bit. We should definitely work on ecosystem services. I know Fran is working on some of this stuff. There's lots of work to be done. We should definitely work on how trade plays into this. But I'll leave you with one thought of whether this makes a difference or not. So Alan and I had an early collaboration a while back, thinking about an example. What if we could snap our fingers and turn all class 7 and 8 trailer trucks into electric trucks? I know this is like ground zero about thinking about, you know, different trucking world. So we're catching up with you folks, not very quickly. We might never. But the notion here is, what if we could snap our fingers? What does that mean economically and socially? So we built this over 6 or 7 years. This is a paper with Jason Porcio and Corinne Scown and Will McNeil, a model that doesn't have a single regression in it. Fran looked at me and was like, this is a paper that doesn't have a regression. Fran's like, you wrote a paper that doesn't have a regression? What? It's a full characterization of the private and social costs of electrifying class 7, 8 trailer trucks, soup to nuts. And to make a long story short, this is out for review, so please don't like take a picture and tweet this or something. But the basic notion is, if you just look at private costs, electric trucks are massively more expensive, even under a renewable grid and reasonable electricity price assumptions at reasonable time horizons for operators. If you add the social costs in, the answer changes significantly. From a social point of view, class 7, 8 trailer trucks in this particular model right here are a way better deal for society than continuing to do even evolving diesel trucks. So again, raising this notion that what's the right answer here hinges crucially on taking into account what the social costs are and gives us some guidance as to what you could possibly do to get some of this technology going. We could talk for 3 hours about electric trucks, and what about charging? You need to build like little nuclear fired power plants next to truck stops and things like that. So we can talk about that kind of stuff, but I just wanted to say that this is not some niche thing. It makes a real difference in what we recommend and also in what policies get passed and which ones don't. So if you have questions, my email is not on here. That's bad. It's my last name at berkeley.edu. It's pretty easy. Auffhammer, Auffhammer at berkeley.edu. Always happy to chat. But as I said before, if you want to get really deep and insightful answers, I would go to fran.moore at ucdavis.edu first. So thank you for having me and happy to take any questions. Questions, comments, concerns? Everybody signed the attendance sheet? You haven't, or you have a question? Yeah, he's attended, we got an attendance sheet person.
So I have a
Yes,
small historical correction, but you are in the end right. The first time cost benefit analysis was included in legislation was 1974 in the Warren Alderman Act, which established the California Building Efficiency Regulation. It was, as you said, also signed by Governor Reagan. It's all correct.
I will add it to my storytelling. So he was instrumental in the significant success of benefit cost analysis, but as most things, the good stuff starts in California and then finds its way to Washington. Yeah. Yes, and say your name, please.
Dave,
Hi, Dave.
in your economic models of energy and futures, how do you account for like low probability but high impact like events like Chernobyl, for example?
So the answer is we don't, right? So there are some people out there. There's somebody named Simon Dietz and folks, for some reason, many of them in the UK, but there's also a person at MIT, Bob Pindyke, who's very opinionated but brilliant, who think about, you know, what are the consequences of large scale disasters, both within climate change, but also not within climate change. What if the thermohaline conveyor belt or whatever that thing is called stops, right? What if we get like some of these storms that are like 20x what we're seeing today? So low probability, high damage events. There's a gentleman who's unfortunately no longer with us, Marty Weitzman, who also helped us thinking about these types of settings. So to make a long story short, we're thinking about it. I don't think, and Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that's formally built into the current social cost of carbon. But if you're looking at issues where people think that should be in there, that's got to be near the very top of the list. And just one follow-up to that, it requires knowing what the extreme events sort of are, right? The other scary thing is there are extreme events that we don't know could be built into the climate system and accelerations and things like that. They're just going to come out of nowhere. So how do you hedge against disasters that you don't even know are going to happen yet? Yeah.
Can I put an asterisk up? Can you go back to the like SEC distributions?
Yeah.
So it's true that they're not like explicitly, yeah, or like maybe the next one.
That one.
Yeah, but like look at the tails on those distributions, right?
Yeah.
So that's coming from just like the probability sampling like in the current model, and like so we're not like explicitly representing like, oh, here's a very unlikely event, but to some extent we are capturing that because you have this long tail that goes way out to like 800, right? And so that's going to pull the mean value out significantly in a way that, like, you know, these are very low probability events, but they're kind of having this big effect on the mean.
And so we have the circular argument, like, yes, the distribution has a long tail, but the modeling itself doesn't really in it have some module of like
There's a
super
catastrophe
extreme,
module.
catastrophe module, which would be kind of interesting. In the EPA document, they also give you one number, they give you the mean, but they also give you like the 95th percentile of the distribution to just kind of get at that point, like how high is the upper tail of that distribution. But I personally find this, I really like reading science fiction too. So disaster modeling, it is something we don't do enough of, but it's also really, really hard because econometrics is not something you can meaningfully do for the really large disasters because there aren't enough of them. So then you have to, take a stand on some sort of damage function. Yes. You can,
Why does the discount rate, which I understood is a single number, have a probability distribution at all? And why is it different now?
so the beautiful thing here, so there's discounting and there's the rate you pick, right? So where are we? So you have to pick some rate, but the way you discount in the end right here, for example, depends on the growth rate of GDP, right? So in a richer world, we're going to discount damages differently than in a poorer world. So what this model did is that I did here, I always forget whether it's eta or G. G is the GDP growth rate, I would hope so. But so G in the discounting here is consistent with, for any scenario you run here, they look at the trajectory of GDP or sort of income over time, and whatever state you're finding yourself in, that feeds right into the discount range for the run you're doing here, right? So the notion here is that there's, and maybe I'm just gonna hand this over to Fran, who knows this stuff better than I do, but you want to think about the marginal value of 1 unit of consumption in a richer world rather than the marginal value of consumption of 1 more unit in a poorer world, and that should affect how you discount future consumption into the present. Is that a fair characterization? So I am happy to shoot me an email if this stuff interests you. There are some really amazing, pretty accessible think pieces on why we're doing it this way and what's the advantage of one versus the other out there. This is not uncontroversial, right? This is not like we've all settled on this and everybody agrees. Like, people still get pretty grumpy about this particular thing, and then get pretty grumpy. You need to pick something called the risk-free rate too. So like, how we pick the risk-free rate, what is that? Like, in the nitty-gritty there's a bunch of grumpy economists like sniping at each other. I don't know if the La Jolla shirt was next or I think you were next, and then we'll go to you.
I think in the presentation said that the current cost is like, the mean is like $120, but you said there are a lot of sectors that are not included, so would the actual cost would probably be much higher, right? Is there like an estimate, like how much it would be higher if you would include all the sectors?
So, are you also German?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Which is your soccer team?
Cologne.
Oh, that's fine. I like Basky. Okay, very cool. That's a long time ago. But the notion here is the number was 190, so 120. That was just the comparison with the discount rate there. But that's a discussion that we're having over and over again, right? If we fix this again, does the number get much higher? So for example, if you start messing with discounting a little bit and you fix some of the things that people don't really like about how we pick certain rates, I actually think that's going to drive the number down a little bit. But if you add in ecosystem services, if you add in migration, if you add in like a bunch of the big things, labor productivity is one where we have nascent understanding of what's happening there. But it turns out, like, in manufacturing and ag and places like that, people really don't like being hot, right? So what happens to productivity of workers that are exposed to the outdoor environment or work in non-air conditioned places inside? It's not clear to me. So I personally, if I have to take it, but I think the number is probably much higher than $200. $200 number makes most things we're doing for climate change. Most of the policies we're talking about that are politically feasible, they pass the benefit cost there. So I think I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but Billy Pizer, I believe, a long time said, once the SEC passes $150, like most things make sense. So I think that's sort of implicitly where some people have landed, but the true number might be much higher. I'm going to say one more annoying thing. I have a pet peeve. There's people who regress gross domestic product or growth rates on temperatures and then do some sort of magic and they back out a social cost of carbon, all of these regressions come out with massively large, like $1,000 social cost of carbon. These are fine regressions to run, but what comes out of these papers is not a social cost of carbon for reasons that are maybe too subtle, but GDP is not a welfare measure. And I really dislike personally these papers, but I'm not, again, there's a lot of people who really like these papers. So it's my humble not so humble, but personal opinion. In the blue shirt.
In the ramification, the term rho decides the pure rate of time difference. It's basically talking about if you value the future generation model numbers. So in context of climate change, is it ethically defensible to set that term more than zero?
Well, whatever you're working on, we should just sign your, a document you passed. So I also like the signaling, like, I know this is ranting, Max. So well done. Well, last question. So this is a question that should involve more philosophers and ethics folks than we sometimes do, right? This is economists talking to each other. So I started reading this like the invisible veil stuff, right? What if you could put all generations in a room? You don't know which generation you belong to, and you jointly have to decide on what discount rate you should use, right? That's maybe the right way to decide. That is not an experiment you can run because we don't observe future generations, but what rate of pure time preference would a room like that decide on? So there's some folks out there like Christian Traeger, another German economist, I don't know why this is, who's thought about this pretty carefully. And if you want more, I'm happy to send you some stuff, but I don't think that's settled at all, right? Because it's fundamentally, as you said, a sort of ethical question. Yeah.
Well, I'll say, I know the IWG is disbanded again, but I'm looking forward to when it gets reinitiated. The federal government, as you're probably tracking, is looking more at, inward of what damages are being caused. As you mentioned, Trump wanted to look at in his last term, just the US. And in some federal agencies, they don't even want us to look at that. They want us to look at like project scale. And so I'm kind of curious, how could we use these ideas, which I know, and I agree, global is, it makes sense. And ethically, I think it makes sense. But for being able to account for these costs on project scale, like how could we adjust these or use them, or is it just don't do it?
No, so I think even if you're asked to only use the project scale ones, I think it is crucially important to report the other ones if they're calculatable in the report, right? Or whatever it is you're doing. To, if you think they're using the wrong number and you're required to use one, then use the one that you're required, but there's nothing that stops you from also reporting, well, if you use the economically, you don't call it that, but if you use the domestic or the global number, here's how the answer would change, because you just generally never know what, assemblyman or woman or federal regulator that it lands on the desk. And in Trump, one that actually happened a lot for those of us who wrote comments on, cafe regulation and so on. Like there were a bunch of reports out there from federal agencies that yes, said, the domestic number is the one we should use, but here's the number if you use the global one. And then, makes it easier for people to comment.
I'm not sure if you've tracked the latest SCOTUS decision for 7 counties infrastructure coalition, Eagle County. They basically reduced how much downstream and upstream effect you can account for. NEPA's scope got limited way down in time and space. And so NEPA is no longer a viable way to bring these ideas into that planning process in the federal government. So I'm looking for a way. And I mean, maybe that does come down to just individuals just in their agency, but it's, we now have page limits, 75 for an EA, 150 for an EIS. And so
there's really, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Maybe I could tuck it away in an appendix,
Right.
you know, but I want it to be meaningful. I want it to be, you know, what we use for
No.
decision.
So I get that, and I don't have a good answer for it, but I think, you know, people read these impact assessments and go on the record saying, you know, this is the wrong way of doing it, here's the science why this is the wrong way of doing it. And if you give them the ingredients required to write their response to whatever it is they ultimately do, then it's in the record, right? You know, will it lead to better outcomes in the long run? It's not clear to me, but it strikes me putting that stuff in the record, which is why many write comments on federal rules and so on. Who knows how they're going to use it, but it's important to provide those folks with the ingredients, because you know the NGOs and so on might not be able to calculate the number that you can calculate for the project you're looking at. So putting that out there in an appendix, even. You know, sometimes it's a sheet on a spreadsheet somewhere that, you know, eyes find it, and it gets used, but this is what happened last time.
I can make a difference for.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you beating the drum.
Yeah.
I hope I get to cite you someday.
All right. Yeah,
I had one question.
Say your name.
Like Lauri. I had one question regarding the distributions, and or I see that as one of the most exciting like advancements now, that there's a distribution over the potential scenarios. Do I understand it correctly that this distribution is fixed, or is it a function of part of the model as well? Because one exciting next step would then be to think about, well, do some policies affect the distribution of potential future scenarios differently, and therefore maybe reduce the variance, not only the mean in carbon emission, which, like, yeah, as risk averse people, we probably would appreciate, right?
so first off, what I maybe didn't stress so much here, but the one of the cool things about this modeling approach is uncertainty is fully integrated throughout the model, right? So the uncertainty from the socioeconomics feeds through to the uncertainty in the emission scenarios, feeds through into the climate scenarios, feeds through into damage functions. There's also parametric uncertainty as to, you know, how steep a response function is in there. So it's all integrated, which is why it's coded up in Julia, which is really, really fast and lets you do runs relatively quickly. So things you can do, right? Like, say you have a policy where you think all of a sudden all electricity is carbon free, and that's going to change the emissions trajectory, right? You just change that. I mean, I'm going to say you change that parameter. It's probably like several weeks of coding until you figured out which line of code you need to change. But then, you know, you rerun it again, and it will fully redo the distribution of the thing with whatever you've changed. But it's quite elegant and quite beautiful and quite non-parametric, right? So the regression coefficients all have their, you know, whatever I assume asymptotic distributions associated with them, but the scenarios, that stuff is, you know, it's not normal or chi-square or Cauchy or something. It's just a non-parametric distribution that where the tails could change, the central tendency could change. It's really cool. Yeah, trying to get your accent. I'm not sure. Sweden?
Swiss.
Swiss. I got the first two letters of the country right.
So can we go in 12? I mean, we'll take like just a couple more questions.
I think you got a question on the chat as well.
Oh,
I can, yeah, let me, we should take a look at that.
This is so fancy.
There we go.
oh, here.
So yeah, there was a question here. Curious how future income is being modeled a few slides back. How are other metrics of well-being besides income or reorganization of material intensity of well-being incorporated to income projections?
They're not, right? So this is old school gross domestic product. It's more, it's income, right? So, but it doesn't have the sort of circular economy, you know, sort of non-market well-being utilitarian thing built in the way I think this questioner is asking. So of course something to think about. Some of this plays in when we think about discounting frameworks, right there, their utility clearly plays a huge role, but the income scenarios, I think we're just drawing lines in the sand of what dollars and cents are going to be over 275 years. That's a really good question.
Okay, unfortunately, I think,
We're gonna stop?
yeah.
Yeah, if you have questions, Auffhammer, 2 Fs, right? Frank, at berkeley.edu, always happy to chat.
Okay, thank
Thanks for having me.